Okay, so my name is Emma Segal. As Patricio mentioned, I have been doing design work for about 2 decades, which seems a little bit crazy to me now at this stage. Uh, but I started quite young. I started out in graphic design and I moved very quickly into product design. At that period in my career, it was not so common that people would go overseas to do work in the factories, but I had the opportunity of working in a company where I had a lot of opportunity to work in factories. And through that, gained a very multi-leveled and intensive understanding of the full design practice. So I saw that there's a lot of you that come from different areas of design or maybe consulting and so on. So I would love to hear what your questions are as we go through about each of the stages. Some of you might be just starting out your career. Some of you might be in a design management position. I've had the fortune of touching on all of these aspects, and it's really helped inform me about how to make change in the world. So it was through those experiences that I developed an understanding of, first of all, what is the practice of design? Like when you design something, how do we go about doing it? There's the standard ways of imagining something, putting it into a physical form, and then having somebody else create it, or there's ways that you can create it yourself in an entrepreneurial way. I happen to work for a lot of very large companies. Some of them were in some of the designs I did ended up in magazines and movies, on shelves around the world. And it was always a very interesting process for me to go through that organizational process of how to take something that I imagine into reality. And that's essentially what design is. It's taking something that's intangible, something that you've created in your brain, whether it's your own idea or somebody has given you a brief, and then putting it out into the world. And so it was through these projects and initiatives and going into the actual factories where the stuff that I imagined was being created, that I gained a really good understanding of not only the beautiful part of design, which is about creation and putting things that are helpful to people out in the world, hopefully things that bring them pleasure, but also what does it mean when you create something, a product or even a service, that has a tangible impact and specifically negative impacts on the world. For me, it was a very big wake-up call to travel into places where I saw the water being affected, I saw the air being affected, I saw the lifestyle of the people who are actually manufacturing the majority of the things that we use in the world today. I would end up staying in these like very beautiful hotels, as you can see here on the right. This is in India, right next to one of the biggest informal settlements in Southeast Asia, where the level of income and life quality is very, very low. A lot of these things are linked to the products and services that we consume today. And as designers, we have a unique role in that we are responsible for 80% of the ultimate impact of a product or service that goes out into the world. If you imagine not having anything manifested until you have an idea and then ask somebody to build it, all of that process has impacts along the entire life cycle of a product. So when I started to realize this really deeply, I got, you could say, a bit of a cognitive dissonance between the things that I think are important, such as everybody should have a good quality of life. There should be equitable distribution of opportunities and income and education, et cetera. We should all have clean water to drink. And the fact that the things that I was making and putting out into the world were having a negative impact. So I actually quit the design profession. I turned the tables over, left, and went on maybe a 2 year kind of existential crisis. I don't know if any of you have ever had that. But I really had to investigate within myself, like what did I want to contribute to the world? And in the end, I decided that giving up my career in design wasn't something that I was able to do. I really loved making things. I come from parents who work in the arts as well. And so it's really in my system, but also I know the positive effects that it can have. So I went back to school and I got my master's in sustainable design, specifically looking at uh, what does it take for a designer to be a more sustainable designer. I started working for some projects with David Suzuki, and I worked with the Unschool, which is an organization started by a woman named Dr. Leila Ajarlu about how to disruptively make change in the world. I started doing workshops around the world, helping people understand the process of sustainability within design. This has taken me into up here on the left, you have a workshop I did in Denmark around post-disposability, and down at the bottom in South Africa and Cape Town, understanding the life cycle impacts of the apparel industry, which is actually one of my specialties. So this is a picture here of Layla. I've worked with Layla and the Unschool for the past almost 10 years. I think it's about 9 now. She was awarded Champion of the Earth in 2016 for her work. And it's been a great and very exciting project to work on all the different aspects. We've worked with very large organizations such as Heineken and Oxfam and United Nations, creating either communication campaigns or helping bring people together in workshops to understand the problems that they're trying to solve or how to approach things in a more sustainable way. And we have a whole methodology around it. The Unschool is great. The 12-part methodology covers all the things that you would actually need to develop your own personal practice, from building ethics and empathy understanding to systems thinking, which we'll talk about in a second, how to make change, how to get things out into the world, how to amplify them, because if you make things in a vacuum, then nothing happens. And then also what we're going to talk about a little bit today is the cognitive science aspect of it too. So these are some of the projects that we worked on. One of the things we try to do is make sure that any paid projects we get, there is a free component to it. There is a large portion of the world that does not have the same economic distribution as most of the countries that produce the products that make it. So most of products, consumer work ends up happening in North America or Western Europe, and then the manufacturing of it ends up in lower income countries and the global South. So we want to make sure that the people that are being affected by these practices also have equal access to the resources that can help them change them. So that's why we offer 20% of everything we do for free or very, very low cost. We do lots of education stuff too. Down here at the bottom in the blue, we have this circular classroom project. If you're at all in teaching or interested in teaching, you can go to the website circularclassroom.com. It's free. There's workbooks, manuals, videos. It's meant for high schools, but it's really great for anybody. With Oxfam, we developed a toolkit so that anybody can put a workshop on to get more creative campaigns around social and environmental change and so on. So we have lots of alumni. I would also recommend going to the Unschool website and reading their stories. It's very inspirational to hear what people have done afterwards in all parts of the world. They're also open to being chatted with. So if you find somebody that's really on a project that you find interesting, please reach out to them. So design. Design typically, and I'm right in the midst of doing a PhD on design and sustainable design. And the definition of what it is so vast, but essentially it's about creating anything. And in this context, products or services. Products we know have very tangible impacts. So air, water, people that make it, but services also have physical impacts. They touch on all aspects of the resources that we need, energy, water, etc., cooling, but also the people that facilitate them. So if you're a service designer, not a product designer, all of the same principles apply, just in slightly different ways potentially. So my goal now is any design project that I take on is to help design a better world. And sometimes that's educational products, and sometimes it's consulting, and sometimes it's actually physically making things. Essentially, design, we are well equipped as designers to solve complex problems. We need this kind of ability to see things on a broader, more creative scale and break out of the silos that we often get stuck in. If you're, for example, no flack to engineers, I love engineers, but they're very specifically about functionality, or in a marketing department, very specifically about the sales, about selling something, about positioning it and framing it. As designers, we kind of interact with all of these levels, including the people that make things. So it's really important that part of our mindset is understanding all the levels that we touch on. And one of the greatest kind of frameworks that I can offer you is the way that we teach it at the Unschool, which is through systems thinking, sustainability sciences, and then design as an approach to change. So we understand that humans create linear systems. That's kind of what got us into the problem in the first place. Science developed that way. We dissect things, study them in individual parts, and everything gets very, very siloed. It's very reductive. And that's kind of what's caused a lot of the problems. We think about the economy in very specific components, and it's all based on extraction and exploitation, both of people and natural resources. So that includes things that are going to waste, but also what are you putting into things from the very beginning? So this results in lots of problems. We know about plastic pollution, we know about the ocean, we know about air pollution. These things are well established now. When I started my career 20 years ago, we never talked about this. It's still not in a lot of design educational programs, but it is starting to appear more and more. And unfortunately, we're dealing with the ramifications of what's happened over the increase of mass manufacturing since the 60s. So what we call these are externalities. They're like side effects of activities that aren't really accounted for. So this can be good or bad. For example, if you have honeybees, then they might be pollinating a field next to you and they get an increased level of crops. That's not kind of factored into the cost of it or the benefit of it, but it's something that just happens. What's unfortunate is when it's a negative impact. So if you're doing dyeing in a factory and then that water isn't recollected, cleaned, and so on, that effluent can go into the river and pollute it. And this happens all the time. But unfortunately, nobody under the systems we have today are responsible for that. And so that's an externality. Same with plastic in the ocean. A lot of the plastic in the ocean is actually from, we think it's a lot from clothing, but one of the top factors is also from tires. So when cars drive on roads, bits of rubber come off, they go into the drainage and sewage system and wash out into the ocean. That's an externality. Nobody's responsible for it. Nobody pays for the cleanup. And it's not really a problem that anybody specifically has to deal with. We try to fix these issues in a lot of ways, but without having like a really good systems thinking way of approaching them, they often become new problems. And Peter Senge here is, if you're interested in systems thinking, I highly recommend reading his work. His quote is, today's problems are often yesterday's solutions. We see this so often. There was a huge burst of motion around sustainability and ethical consumption in the 80s, but that resulted in a lot of the same problems that we still are dealing with today. So we really need to understand the systems we're intervening in and how the best interventions can be put into place so we're not causing unintended negative impacts. This requires a big shift in value. Our economy is so focused on finances, and all of these industries, like the people that make our things, all of the infrastructure, the government, the design industry, these are all interrelated, interconnected. And right now is such an interesting point in history because we're going through a huge shift. There's all these new policies in the EU. Businesses are changing, not quickly enough, but it's happening. We hear about it in the news all the time. And this is very exciting. But with any kind of broad movement, there's going to be a lot of mistakes at the beginning, and we need a little bit of flexibility around that. There is a lot of demand for it. If you look at any newspaper around the world, we see tons of reports about how much people want to buy things that are environmentally friendly. I'm sure if you go to anybody in the street, they're not going to say that they want something that's made by modern slave labor, for example, or something that harms the plants and animals or the air that we depend on to breathe. Yet the change still isn't happening very quickly. So that's the interesting thing about the new regulations that are coming up. They are going to require companies to report on these things. And so as a result, we've been seeing that they're starting to include this more in annual reports. If you haven't encountered this yet, if you're working in an organization, it is going to come up very soon. It was January 25th that some of these regulations in Europe came into place. And while that is happening in Europe, it also affects anybody who sells into Europe. So if you create a product or service and you want to access the 500 million people that live in Europe, you're going to have to adhere to these same standards. And that's going to become something that's regulated. Some of these things are already in place. Some of them are about to be coming into place. Most of them are centered around what we call the circular economy. So if you haven't heard that before, it's transitioning from what I had just covered in a linear system where we make waste. So we take things out of the earth, we make stuff out of them, move them over to the consumer, they use them, then throw them away. Whereas circular systems design, where at the design aspect, we are already thinking about the full life cycle of that product and how to mitigate and reduce the negative impacts. So this is a global shift. Right now, the world's only 8 or 9% circular, but it is increasing, and these new regulations are going to make it compulsory in a lot of places. As with any new regulations, they tend to filter down. I live in Canada already. The Canadian government is starting to implement some of the rules that the EU is putting in, and so on and so forth. So it may take a little bit of time, but this Green New Deal, it is very exciting. It's one of the most comprehensive suite of policies that comes up. And one of the more exciting ones for me anyway is the Sustainable Products Initiative. There's also a Sustainable Product Passport that's going to be put into place. So these are things that are focusing on products specifically and will standardize the way that we design things and then legislate what actually gets to be allowed to be sold. The CSRD is also an interesting new law that is now in place. And that one requires that organizations put into their annual reports what they're reporting on and what the risk is if you don't do it. So for example, if you use water in the production of your product, which almost every product does, or even services, because you probably rely on servers to use the internet, then you have to put into your report what is the risk to your company if there's a problem with water access or a drought or a fire, if that's a risk to your company if you depend on wood, for example. So this is going to put a very direct link between finances and sustainability, which is something that for the business community, because it's driven by GDP and by financial performance, is going to really help motivate them. But of course, we also hope that people do it because it's the right thing to do, and we want to breathe clean air and have clean water, etc. However, because companies are financially driven, these are tactics that are going to be put into place to make sure that some of these aspects are put into their company strategy. So employee rights, there's a lot around human rights, for example, what the risks are for that, and then how they're reported. So making sure that the reporting that they're doing is accurate and it means something. It's not just making goals and promises. So I really recommend that if you hadn't already engaged with some of these things, definitely look into it. They're going to become more and more predominant. Some of the details are still a little bit vague, but it is happening. So before you get overwhelmed, I just want to note that this is a big change and shift in our world, and it is hard. It takes a lot of courage. We have a lot of companies that don't want to engage with these things because it's a big task. They don't know how to do it. They're worried about pushback from consumers. They don't have the time and resources. These are things I hear about all the time, but it's inevitable to happen. And if you are one of the companies that is brave enough to be disruptive and to start out and make things in a new way, that puts you at the forefront of things that are inevitable anyway. And that is, if you want to frame it around a business case, a really good incentive to be the leader in that space. So not just replicating what we've done before, like low-hanging fruit, recycling at a head office, for example. Great, we've been doing that for decades, but really being disruptive and saying we're going to change the entire way that we make products and services and becoming somebody that everybody else looks up to. It will, because of this interest in the consumer level, it will get you new customers, but it will also reduce the risk from those new policies that are coming up and probably gain a lot of new business. This is a welcome change. There's this great philosopher, Heraclitus, I never say it correctly, who says there's nothing permanent except change. And this great quote, which I love, which is no man can step into the same river twice, which if you think about it, every time you make a new product or service, all the context for that is slightly different. The rules are different, the customers are different, how you've been thinking about it is different, people's tastes and values change all the time. But you can use this design power that we have as designers or working in design department to address these. I am particularly interested in design and designers specifically because we are responsible for such a huge impact, that 80% I mentioned of what happens at the end. We design the way the world works, all of the physical objects, this thing and that thing. laptop that I'm talking to you from, every single thing around you is made by a designer, whether it's nice or not. And the way that it's designed designs the way that we interact with it. The way that I move through an airport, for example, is as a result of the infrastructure design of that airport. There are subtle clues throughout that guide me through different ways. When you go and line up for your tickets and you feel like you're in like a cattle line, it's intentional so that you feel less resistant to being put in a lineup, so you're more obedient. Like these things are very specific around experience design and all of the things that are around us. The way that food packaging is designed will help inform where I put it in the recycling and the garbage, etc. So this responsibility is pretty great. And really what, as designers, it's important to understand is what's within your own sphere of influence that you can impact. We can't address everything. If you're a product designer at a shoe company, you're not going to probably be able to affect policy, for example, but you can affect the materials that you're choosing. You can recommend different things. You might be able to convince them to let you go to the factory to understand how it's put together. I've done that so many times and discovered so many things just from being in the factory. Like we had raincoats, for example, that were always failing the lead test. Why would there be lead in a raincoat? It turned out that they were drying them on the top level of the factory, and all the car exhaust, because this was in a country where there was still leaded gasoline, was settling on the rain jackets. It had nothing to do with the production process. So that was a really simple thing. We spent thousands of dollars testing them, and all we had to do was put them in a closed room. So the more that you develop your experience, the more that you build your skills, the more you can influence things. And that takes time. So whether you're starting out in your career or you're kind of closing at the end, you're going to have different amounts of capacity. So one of the main points that I really, really want to put into everybody's head is that every single thing comes from nature. And that's why it's so important that we understand how we're intervening. We're on a closed system, the globe. You can't go to space or Mars to get stuff. And we don't send things to Mars or to space when we're done with it. Everybody comes from nature and everything goes back into nature. So it's really, really important to understand the full life cycle of anything that you're putting out into the world. And the best way that we can make sure is that we're not doing harm is by designing it so that it has positive or regenerative impacts. There's a lot of different strategies out there. This is only a snapshot. There is sustainable design strategies. There's circular business design models. All of them are useful. We can talk about product as a service. This one is always a really great one and also time honored. If you put out a product, instead of selling it to somebody one time and making money, you can lease it to them and make money over and over. This is not revolutionary, but there's so many one-time use products out in the world that could be converted to different models and then not have to take the raw resources from the natural resources that we use. Tool libraries are a great example of this. If there's not one near you, then I recommend you find somebody who can start one. I don't know why everybody needs a hammer. How many times do you use a drill, for example? Why not just rent one? Or borrow is even better. Resell. So again, if a company takes back the products, Patagonia is always a model that's used for this. You can take that back and then resell it again to a different customer. This doubles the amount of money that you're making on it. Or if you resell it 3, 4, 5 times, Patagonia has a lifetime guarantee. So imagine they take a jacket. They actually have very high resale value in Japan specifically. You could resell it 5, 6, 7 times. As a company, this is a great business case. From a sustainability point of view, you're not taking new materials to make more jackets. IKEA does this with their furniture. You can extend the life of a product. Fairphone has built their phones so that you can take out individual pieces if the camera stops working. If something's cracked, it's super easy to replace it. You don't have to replace the whole phone. Phones are full of heavy metals, of precious metals like gold, silver, and all sorts of plastics and other very resource intensive materials. We can remanufacture things. So in a circular redesign model, we want to take things that we have produced, and instead of taking new resources, we take the pieces and parts of the things we've already made and reconfigure them in a new way so that we're reducing the amount we're taking from nature, hopefully eliminating it. If it's something that's an organic bio-based material like cotton, for example, if it's organic, we can put it back into nature, so remetabolize it through composting. But either way, we're trying to take the resources from the products that we have and then put them back into the system so that we don't have to rely on raw virgin materials. Mud Jeans is an example I love to talk about. They do a leasing system for their jeans. They're a little bit expensive, but you rent them for the year. And when you send them back, they recycle them into new jeans. And they have engineered the material so that it's easy to break down for them. And also, it has the least amount of other fibers. So if you have a t-shirt, for example, that's 50% polyester, 50% cotton, you cannot recycle that currently. It's very difficult to separate the materials. The polyester has to go into one stream. The cotton has to go to another. So Mud Jeans has, from the design stage, decided we're going to recycle these. So we need to create them in a way that it's easy to disassemble them. Repairing is very simple. iFixit is a great company. They have reverse engineered all of the Apple products. They have repair guides. Incidentally, they have a lot of videos about how to repair things filmed by women because tech is something that's very like male dominant. And so they want women to feel like it's more accessible. And so they purposely use women to show you how to take things apart and put them back together. If you have any broken tech, just go there. They'll send you a kit and a guide. It's great. Sharing platforms like clothing libraries. And then one of the most key things is using waste as a resource. So when we take things and put them into a landfill, they just get zombified. They end up just either leaching into the ground or fossilizing. When we burn things, yes, we get energy from it, but all of the resources that went into that product are now wasted. Or if we lose things, leakages, we call it, into the ecosystem, like plastics into the ocean, then we also lose that as well. So these are really valuable resources. And a fun fact is that one of the biggest repositories of gold in the world is in landfills from all of the abandoned tech that we have. If you took all of that tech and took the gold out of it, we would have a huge abundant source of gold. It's just that it's very expensive because it's not designed to be disassembled. There's a lot in the food industry where we have, this is an example of regrained. So they take the waste product from beer making, for example, and I think they've kind of expanded into other things, and then they put them into granola bars, which is great because now you're not taking the waste product of one company and putting it into the garbage, but instead you're putting it into a new product. Heineken does this as well. When they make beer in Southeast Asia, they use rice. When you clear a rice field, you have to burn it. So instead of burning it out in the open, they take the rice husk, they put it into an incinerator, they burn it down into silica, which the tire companies really need to make tires. So instead of getting silica from other resources, they take the waste product from the Heineken beer making process, from the rice growing, and they use that silica. And so it's kind of a win-win scenario. And so this idea of like waste not being wasted and instead being seen as a great, a valuable resource is a really key aspect of it. This is what we try to build these like circular supply chains. So at every stage of the life process, there's a way that we can maximize the benefit and also, because it's business, the revenue potentially as well. So stewardship is about taking responsibility across the entire life chain. There's many examples of this. Nudie jeans is just one. They have free repair all along the life of your jeans. So if you buy these jeans, you have repair for life. They've built them around recyclability, around reusing them, around retaking them back. So essentially, it's just understanding. I teach a lot of workshops to young designers who are about to go into school. And I kind of explain to them in this way that when you design something, it's like your baby, right? Like a child that you've created, and you can't just abandon it out in the world. You have to take care of it along each stage of its life. So you have to make sure that you know where it's going to go and where it's going to end up. One of the biggest mistakes I ever made in my professional career was using compostable, biodegradable shipping bags, which they use for the container ships across the ocean when making deliveries of mass-produced goods. I didn't realize at the time, which is my mistake, it was quite a long time ago. The internet wasn't as sophisticated as it was now to find these things out. But those bags need a very special industrial composting facility. Otherwise, they contaminate either of the biological, like composting, or the technical, like the recycling systems they end up in. It's really important to understand where is your product going, how is it interacting with the systems it ends up in, what are people going to do with it, and so on. And one of the first things that I always try to encourage people to think about is, does this even need to be made? Like, is this product that you're putting out into the world useful? Is it helpful? Is it redundant? Could you team up with somebody and collaborate with somebody instead? Could it be a service instead of that? And then if you have decided at the end of this internal investigation, no, I really want to make this product or service, then how can you best make it? Who's making it? What raw materials are being used? These supply chains are very opaque, but if you ask enough questions, you can usually get some of the answers. What happens as the customer is using it? Some of these things we're very used to thinking about as designers, but what happens after the use? Can it be repaired? Can it be remanufactured? Like, what can you do to make sure that it goes into a beneficial system, hopefully a regenerative one, but at least not a negative one? It's great if something can be recycled, but how many times can it be recycled? Are you only prolonging the inevitable? Is it going to be recycled 3, 4 times and end up in a landfill? How can you reduce that opportunity of that happening? All of these things are connected. Everything actually in our entire world is connected. This is a photo of a sand dune. There's a really interesting natural phenomenon where the exact amount of nutrients that get washed away from the South American jungles gets blown over in nutrients from the deserts in Africa. We live in a very interconnected world, and everything that you do has ramifications, not just in your place, in your time, but across time and space. You have no idea where the products that you're making are going to end up in the world and who they're going to affect and at what level of time scale. It might be today, tomorrow, it might be 100 years from now. So this is really the idea of like using systems thinking. We're all, if you want to understand a system, you just have to look at yourself. You have lungs that breathe. This is your oxygen. We have eyesight. We have a stomach. So our digestive system. We have systems in the natural world, rain systems that go into the rivers and then evaporate up. And then we have rain that comes back down. Everything around us is a system, and they are interdependent on each other. We cannot exist without water, air, soil. And we need to make sure that those things are really, really healthy. Like 50% of the air that we breathe is from the ocean. So if you take a breath right now, half of that might be from trees. And then the other next one is going to be from the ocean. So this is not about being environmentally friendly or about saving the planet. It's really about maintaining the very delicate balance of survivability, hopefully thrivability, that humans need to exist in. In every one of these systems, there's always the very obvious parts and then the ones that we don't see. So we normally see things as very event-oriented, what happened. But underneath it all is where the systems thinking comes into play, where we see all of the different patterns over time, the structures that have influenced that. They might be political, they might be organizational in your company, but also the mental models that we have. So what are the assumptions and beliefs I have? What's influenced me culturally, socially, etc. These are a lot of the hidden things that influence what the events are that happen in the end. And so it's through systems thinking that we really start to understand how we're being affected and how we can affect others. And that's on very big scales. We use this telescope as a way to think about it. What's the overarching umbrella view? And then very micro scale, like, okay, what is the specific thing I can do? And what we do is important. So we need to make sure that instead of doing the wrong thing right, we're doing the right thing. And an example of this might be, like I said, the bags that I explained to you, the compostable bags, that I thought I was doing the right thing, but because I didn't have all of the information and understanding, instead I was doing the wrong thing. I thought I was doing the right thing, but it was the wrong thing. So that means that, there's this big gap in sustainability, especially in sustainable design around education, both in academics and also in professional training. And so we really have to take it upon ourselves at this particular stage in the world to understand the entire systems that we're working within and how we can intervene in each of them at each life stage. So from the very beginning of when we create it to like, how is it getting manufactured? Who's making it? Like, what conditions are they making it in? How much are they being paid? What percentage of the product is that? Could we pay them more? Just because something is a good wage, let's say, in a country that has historically lower income wages, doesn't mean that that's fair or equitable. Have we designed it to be remanufactured? What kinds of transportation is being used? Are they trucks? Are they diesel trucks? Is it coming across on a cargo ship? Um, how is the person using it? Do we have clear instructions about where things go and what the end of the life plan is? Life cycle thinking is a really, really useful thing for anybody. You can do it on the back of an envelope, on a piece of paper. You take yourself through each stage of it. What are the materials being used? If I'm doing something simple like a t-shirt, even just look at what's the thread holding the sleeves together, what's the buttons made out of, up to more complex items like a car has many, many materials. So breaking that down, sometimes we call it an autopsy or product breakdown or teardown. It's kind of fun. If you're doing any kind of education, it's a great activity to do with kids. For young people, something like a chocolate chip cookie. For design students, get them to bring in an object from home. Or if you're working in a company, something that you already make is a perfect example. How is it packaged? Not just for the retailer and for the consumer, but along the whole transportation phase as well. How is it used? Does it need to have energy input, like being plugged in like a phone, or is it a chair that doesn't have energy, but might be really difficult to take apart for the end of its life? So these are all about like, what are the things that are going into it? What's the function that's happening, and what are all the outputs that come out of it? Um, this is a kind of schematic of the biological and technical cycle I mentioned. So it's really important to understand when you're doing this life cycle thinking to draw out what parts of these things are organic in nature, so basically can be remetabolized back into the earth, and what are now, because they've been transformed, more on the technical cycle, which means if you put it in the ground, nothing's going to happen to it, or it might have a negative effect. So how can we make sure that we reuse those components in a way that's going to reduce the damage that it may have otherwise? So this looks at sourcing, it looks at suppliers, manufacturing, what's going on at your warehouse, your inventory, what is the signage being done in your store? Like we worked with Heineken for their events management, for example. Like you wouldn't necessarily think of it, but a company that sells beer has a lot of events, concerts, stuff like that. So how do you take the sustainability principles you have from the product itself, which in their case is very sustainable, to what about these other events that you're having where there might be vinyl signs, people with plastic water bottles? So how do you manage that? How do you transfer these values over to all aspects of the things that you touch on and have impact on? Some useful guidelines that there's tons now, GRE, all of the EU ones I mentioned, but ISO is kind of useful. There's the guidelines on social responsibility. So it goes through a lot of human rights stuff, fair operating practices. ISO 14001 is the environmental aspects. And there's a new one coming up around circular economy. So this is not published yet, but it is very interesting because it defines the terminology, the principles, and gives guidance. All of these are voluntary. They're not mandatory, but if you can meet all of these, then it's really a good guideline and way to kind of dive into starting these things. This is a very quick activity. I have a few templates like this. Feel free to like take a screenshot, or we have some of these on the Unschool for free as well. So this is just very basic life cycle map. You can go through, map out what your product or service is having. If you're doing an online service, you still need to draw on resources, energy, cooling, green servers, how lightweight is your code. All of this has a physical impact in the world. And then that also requires manufacturing. So nobody really is exempt. And I will also mention that while the internet is physical in this respect, 40-ish% of the world still has no access to the internet. So if you're designing interventions, or if you're thinking about ways to get change out into the world, remember that half-ish of the world, it's a rough number, has no access to the internet, so very analog interventions. And there's some great ones out there with murals and other workshops and so on. And then the other half that does have access, only a small number of those people have reliable access. And you can imagine who does. So when you're designing things, it's really important, especially if it's digitally based, to understand who's actually seeing what you're doing. So finding the connections in all of this, one really useful tool is systems mapping. This is just something you can do with markers. You put in the system that you're looking at in the center, so apparel in this example, and then without censoring yourself, put in all the things that are related to it. And then once you have everything on the page, and it's really helpful to do this with other people to get multiple perspectives, especially people who don't do the same job as you, get all the perspectives on there, and then start making linkages to see where you see convergences. Out of every one of these maps, and it should be full like this before you start making connections, there's going to be like 2 or 3 insights that you have because you have all these different people contributing. You start to see like, oh, I never saw that these were connected before, but now they are. And hopefully this gives you like a deeper understanding of what kind of solutions you could try out and see if it's going to have a good impact along all the different stages. And this is really thinking about like causality, which is any actions you do and how they shape the future. Feedback loops are something that are very quick and useful as well. This is a great tool to have, where you just understand what is the thing that's happening, what does it lead to, and what does it reinforce. So a feedback loop of not taking action, for example, and maybe you've experienced this in your job or school, you get negative news, I'm not going to do anything about it, so you don't take any action. It just creates a bigger problem. The status quo is maintained, and that just becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop. These are very, very helpful. Single-use products are a very good example of it. We think it's recyclable. People recycle them. We think that that validates having more of it. So there's more consumer demand, more resources are needed. The message out in the market is like, don't worry, it's recyclable. But we know also now that most things don't actually get recycled. The rate of recycling is like 1 to 9%, depending on the industry. So despite the fact that, we keep doing it, it's not having the result that we want. And this is a feedback loop. And it's very, very useful to start mapping these out so that you don't inadvertently or accidentally make something that doesn't produce the positive effect that you want. This is just part of the way our brains work. We have framing that affects the way that we approach things, fear of what our clients might say, fear of change, hesitancy about speaking up. All of these things link into it, and we do get fatigued. There's decision fatigue, choice paralysis, where there's too many choices, you just don't know what to do. These are very important to understand that we all grapple with these things, not just us individually, but also the clients that we have, the companies in general, the people that work within them, et cetera. And so it's understanding what frame of reference we're coming from, knowing that we have all sorts of different perspectives in the world, and that affects our judgments and our values and the decisions that we make. It's really important to approach without judgment. So suspending the need to have a judgment on what's happening and just looking at what is happening. How can I best intervene? Knowing that we have this diversity of perspectives and value judgments, keeping in mind who we are, the context and the power of the situation. Why are we doing things? When, how, etc. And how does that impact and have a ripple effect on the people around us? So knowing all the cognitive biases that we're subject to, and everybody has them, will really help you in your process. I spoke before about cognitive dissonance, and this happens a lot when the actions that we take don't necessarily align with what we believe. So if I want to make sure that I don't harm people or the planet in my work, but I see that happening because I work at, I'm going to say Walmart, even though Walmart has some really good policies, they also have some not great ones. If I'm doing things that I know cause harm, it starts to create this dissonance in our mind. We end up divorcing ourselves from how we feel. And that creates first of all, not a very healthy mental landscape for you, but also it means that people tend to check out and they disassociate and they end up, it just goes into their subconscious mind. where most of our thought processing happens, and nothing ever changes. So there's a lot of these biases that happen. We have negativity bias. Humans have a built-in bias towards the negative. We were trained to look at berries that are red as dangerous, tigers as dangerous. This is to protect us. But now in this day and age, this kind of is harmful because it stops us from taking action. We see change from what the current state is as a loss. The first bit of information we get, we tend to rely on more, so we believe it more, and we also only see what we want to see. These are really important things to understand about ourselves, and you can certainly write about how these affect you or ways that you have seen them come up in your work. But it's also good to know that knowing that this happens to you doesn't mean it won't happen to you in the future. In fact, the more we understand about it, the more prone we are to having it have an effect on us because we think we've solved that problem. So that's fine. We all have these biases. Very important, though, as we're approaching design problems, to understand the frame of reference that you're coming from and the biases that you hold already, and really think about that aspect of yourself to be able to shift your perspective when you're creating things in the world. Don't have fear around it. Like, try to be, as we looked at the beginning, like, have courage and know that it takes time, because fear just leads to inaction. But knowing things, plus knowing the agency and the sphere of influence that you have and having the capacity and the tools to do it, equals hope and action. So awareness itself is quite well shown to not do anything. But if you feel like you know what you can do about it, which means building your skills and capacity, that does actually lead into something. It helps you identify your points of intervention, whether you work in the government or whether you work as a janitor, whatever it is, there's always something you can do. And there's always going to be some trade-offs. The system is not perfect. We don't have perfect ways of solving these problems, especially not right now. So it's really important to understand what is your personal code of conduct. It's going to be different for everyone, which is totally fine. You might be really invested in animal welfare, or you might be really interested in equitable pay. But whatever it is, I tell my students when I'm teaching workshops, how do you know that you've crossed a line if you don't know where the line is? So before you start out on the next stage, really take a look and write down, what are the things that are important to me and what is going to be my personal code of conduct? Like, doctors have this, do no harm. It's a very basic one. And that is a great starting point. But as you're going through your design process, like, keep in mind, what is the line that I will not cross? Even if I'm getting pressure from my manager or my boss or my marketing team or shareholders, stakeholders, etc. We're under all sorts of pressures. I don't want to get fired. I have to pay my mortgage, my rent, etc. Keep at the core of you, what is your code of conduct? And try to work that into every aspect, knowing that these things are all connected. This map behind the lettering here is shipping containers. That's how many cargo containers were going around the world at one moment in time. Here, you can't even see the landmass. That's just the shipping container routes. We have such a massive amount of products moving around in the world, and they have a massive impact on everything that we do and how we live our lives. So it's very important to understand the influence we have and how you can use your design skills, your creativity, or your interaction with people who are designers to solve these problems, change the status quo. And one of the tools that is very useful for this is developing what your theory of change is. So thinking at the very end, you start at the end, what do I want to change? And then you go back to the beginning. What do I need to put in as resources to get there? What actions do I need to take? Who do I need to corral into this project? Like, who do I need to get to help me out? Anticipate the unintended consequences, develop some kind of business model. There's lots of social business model canvases. This is a very simple one. And then get the things that you're doing out into the world. You can have all the best ideas in the world, but if they're not out there, then they'll do nothing. Think about things through a systems thinking perspective. And more than anything, what we pay attention to is what gets made. So make positive change a priority. The more attention you put to it, the more you can convince people to put finances behind it, resources, time, etc., the more it will become a priority. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So I think that just about wraps it up. I'm really excited to hear what your thoughts and questions are. And also, I'll just offer that please keep in touch, send me a message, join the Unschool. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.